Are there any surprising insights that you have learned since deploying that you couldn't have seen without seeing people using the system?
I think the ability, you know, the old adage, and a lot of people have been given the credit for it, you know, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? That has just proven so powerful. I think the biggest surprises for us has just been seeing relationships that we always knew were there, but we could never ultimately see what the relationship was between the subsystems of a building. Occupancy to temperature, elevator occupancy to, as we begin now to look at maintenance, because that whole piece becomes very important. We think we're not getting rid of any data we collect now, because we know there's data that we're collecting today that we don't see value, but we'll see value in it a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. So we think the data exhaust side of this is very interesting and very valuable. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, you can't have a smart city without smart buildings, and you can't have smart buildings without a brain, and DiBOSS is that first brain. So, you know, that I think is very exciting to us, and we think as more and more buildings adopt systems like this, and then that data is stored and analyzed collectively, either by the city, by a private entity, or by the grid operator, the opportunities are amazing. They really are amazing.
And you already mentioned a couple of the benefits in terms of financial savings that have already happened because of DiBOSS. Can you quantify the benefits in terms of energy efficiency?
Sure. We're now seeing the numbers are quite extraordinary. We'll see anywhere, and what's interesting to set your question up for a second is, as investors look at buildings, you know, a lot of people are saying, oh, if they're green, they're worth more money, and if they're LEED, they're worth more money. And I want to talk about LEED. We should come back to that because that's really important. What we see is that the most valuable buildings are going to be the ones that are run the least efficient, because now you can put DiBOSS into them and really create value. So we find that very interesting. So in terms of financial, you're going to see over time, you know, 30% decrease in consumption. Again, the beauty of DiBOSS, and as we build applications that will feed DiBOSS, because we have to remember that DiBOSS is a platform, so that, and we have an open API so that applications can be plugged in. But the difference between an application with DiBOSS and something that's on your iPhone or your iPad is that application will feed to the collective intelligence of DiBOSS. You know, Uber doesn't speak to Spotify, doesn't speak to Waze, right? But the apps that we are developing ultimately will, and it just goes back to the central nervous system, will create a smarter brain, a better brain, a more predictive and prescriptive brain, because it's just adding to that intelligence. It's more data coming in. One of the things that we found interesting, and we're big believers in LEED. We build all of our projects. Our latest project at Greenwich Lane will be the first LEED ND residential project in the city. But what we found was that our most efficient buildings, 3 Times Square, had the lowest Energy Star rating. So that we looked at that and said, I sent the guys back 4 or 5 times. I said, that math's got to be wrong. The math's got to be wrong. The math's got to be wrong. But it wasn't, because LEED really only solves to about 40% of the problem, because 40% of energy consumed within a building goes to core. The other 60% are the tenants that work in that building. So LEED doesn't really, so Bank of America building, 3 Times Square, all these great design buildings, now suddenly when you fill them up, the tenants, that Energy Star analysis skews that so it looks like it's a really lousy building. So then the question you have to ask the question, what are we measuring? And then you have to ask the question, well, what happens after what happens next? Which is, what system do we need to ultimately make the LEED buildings, A, more resilient, B, more sustainable? And that's DiBOSS. Because when we showed our tenants, we're able to take, we call it a tenant fractal. We take that and we show our tenants, okay, you're on 5 floors at 345 Park. Here, on a floor-by-floor basis, is your energy load. Example, 2 floors, exact same floor size, exact same use. One was built out 12 years ago, the other one was built out 6 months ago. The peak load of the new floor is equal to the base load of the old floor. So everything above the base on your old floor is waste. We then show our tenants, we say, you know what? Your base load, defined as what's going on in your space at 3 o'clock in the morning when no one's there, is running at 50 to 60% of your peak. That's just because people aren't shutting things off. So we go to companies like Cisco, who have an EnergyWise product, which is a digital kill switch. Anything that's on the network, you program it, shut it off at 7 p.m., comes back on at 6 a.m., manual override, somebody shows up, they're working late, they turn on their computer, it all comes back on just for them, that computer, not for the O. We install that in our base, we cut our base load by 45%. So again, a tool that's been out there, but you could never truly measure its impact because you didn't have that measurement, i.e. you couldn't manage it.
One of the benefits that's been written about is enhanced livability. Can you speak a little bit about the tenant experience that the system makes possible?
Sure. The beauty of DiBOSS is it's not Jimmy Carter, which is if you're cold, put on a sweater. Mm-hmm. It truly is focused on delivering the maximum level of comfort utilizing the least amount of energy possible. So we talked about the decrease in hot and cold calls. That immediately enhances the tenant experience. The ability to measure carbon and oxygen levels, so you know that you're getting good quality air into space. That's another opportunity. So I think it folds nicely into the wellness. It folds nicely into understanding. I think our tenants, we need to empower our tenants with the same tools that we have to run the core building that they need for their own space, to really go after that 60% of the problem, which is the bigger piece of the pie in terms of consumption patterns within tenant spaces. And people want that. I gave a speech at a group called CoreTech, and they are CoreNet, I think. They are the facility managers for large commercial spaces, the tenant side. And I thought, well, maybe they'll get it, maybe they won't. I felt like a rock star, that rushed the stage. Everybody wanted to see it. Everybody wanted to know why couldn't they get it in their building. This is exactly the data that they need to ultimately get their arms around their own sustainability and resiliency platform for their own company. So we now see DiBOSS as a tenant retention tool because our tenants want this data. They deserve this data. It will help them be more efficient and allow them to tell their story back to their stockholders or their investors of what they're doing to solve these issues. Can
DiBOSS be retrofitted to older buildings?
The beauty of DiBOSS is that it can fit in any building. It's hard, it's software and middleware. You don't need to replace your BMS. You don't need to replace any of your existing systems. It rides on top of your systems, and that ultimately allows those systems to feed up, go to cloud or local server, express that data, and you're able to look at it. It's mobile. We felt it was very important to be mobile. A lot of our competitors are building big conference room size operating centers. Ours is on our iPad and on our mini and on our phone. That's our operating center.
So speaking of other systems to be integrated into DiBOSS, we've all seen things like Nest, the connected thermostat system, and how popular and successful that has been, especially over the past year. And now there are similar systems for monitoring water usage. There are connected refrigerators, there are smart washing machines. Do you see any of these things as connecting up to DiBOSS in certain scenarios, or could you imagine a system, a version of DiBOSS for the home where you could sort of have all of these integrations out of the box?
We're not going after the single-family home market, and we like to say DiBOSS is Nest on steroids. But we are going after the multifamily market. So if you live in a large apartment building, DiBOSS will run the core of that building, monitor all sorts of energy consumption in terms of, your typical apartment building in New York either burns natural gas or oil, heats water or steam, closed loop, and that's about as smart as it gets, which isn't very smart. So what we want to do, we're working with Intel to utilize their gateways to ultimately make dumb machines smart and to solve that language connectivity issue very quickly. So we see the platform operating the core of the building, and then ultimately tenants being able to plug into that, similar on the commercial office space, into the tenant fractal. We'll see individuals being able to plug in, and again, water, temperature, and occupancy are going to be the main things.
In New York, we've seen several severe storms. How is that kind of thing informing the design of a system like DiBOSS, and how can DiBOSS protect tenants against unforeseen catastrophes?
Sure. I mean, it's all about resiliency and sustainability, right? And I don't really see too much difference between those two words. They're really, you need to be sustainable in order to be resilient, and you need to be resilient in order to be sustainable. So I think DiBOSS, again, for us, you look at big storms, and it's what do you have in your basement? What critical hardware is in harm's way? And are you going to either keep the water out or move that equipment out of harm's way? Those are really your only two options. The other thing is how do you create redundant pathways into your buildings from a telecommunications standpoint to allow people to continue to communicate even if something is going on in the street. And what we've been experimenting with is fixed wireless. We own 32 Avenue Americas, which is the original AT&T Long Lines building. Very important historical telecommunications building. It's literally back in the day where you're far too young to remember this, but where you'd want you call up your local operator, and I want a long distance call, I want to call grandma in Miami, and they would say, I'll connect you to a long distance operator. 32 Avenue Americas, there's 5,000 women doing one ringy dingy, two ringy dingy, and they would connect you to the local operator in Miami, which would then call grandma. So we bought that building in 1999. We looked at that and we said, the most important, how do we differentiate that building from all other telco buildings like 111 8th and 60 Hudson? And what's going to happen in the future that we should plan from an infrastructure standpoint to do right now at 32 Avenue Americas? And the short answer was, it's all wireless. And we needed to become the linchpin between broadband wireless and broadband terrestrial networks. So we put 240-foot radio towers on the roof of 32 Avenue Americas, and that is one of the most, I think, the most active rooftop in New York right now. What's interesting is that the fastest networks today are actually wireless networks. Gigabit speed wireless, microwave. So we connect our buildings from 32. We're sitting on top of the internet, perfect throughput, one hop to our buildings, burst it into Wi-Fi. Now with all the iPhone 6s and Androids that are Wi-Fi enabled for voice calling, it's a beautiful thing.
When we consider a future where a lot of the infrastructure is going to be connected to the internet, obviously network security and vulnerability becomes a huge issue. What sort of systems or measures are in place for the DiBOSS system? Yeah,
it's huge. It's really is the question of the day, right? And I think it goes back to your question in terms of automation, because the more we automate, the more peril there is. The more we keep human in the loop, the more opportunity we have for a manual override. So I think there's one piece. of that. I think clearly that's why we're working with Intel. They've, in terms of their expertise of network security and any system that anybody buys has to, that's the number one question. You've got to be able to pass that, check that box that these are the security measures that we have. This is how we keep people out. This is what happens if people get in, what type of alarms go off. And it's a very, very important issue, huge issue.
You mentioned several areas that Rudin Management is looking into for future projects. Is there one that you're particularly excited about and want to mention?
I think, just the development, the application development of DiBOSS is what we're really excited about. We've got we've got the Greenwich Lane that'll be finished about a year from now. We'll start turning apartments over to folks later this year, but done about 13, 14 months from now. So that's a very exciting project. That's keeping us busy and lots to do, lots to finish off there. We're actually creating a park that we're donating to the city of New York, which is an exciting moment. We don't usually get a chance in your lifetime to create a park that the public will be able to enjoy for generations to come. There's an AIDS memorial that will be built there on that park. We donated a building to North Shore LIJ, which they created a state-of-the-art standalone emergency department, which is delivering wonderful health care to Greenwich Village after the closing of St. Vincent's Hospital. So that's a wonderful project. We've got some other things that, stay tuned, we'll be talking about, but can't really talk about right now.
And this is a question that we ask everyone because we're really interested in how people work. Is there a particular software application or hardware application that you find valuable in your own work, whether it's simulations or just workflow?
I would have to say DiBOSS.
Yeah.
To me, the DiBOSS is, we look at it almost as though it's alive. And the branding of DiBOSS, digital building operating system, right? Not a unique name, but I've literally been at shows and have heard people, if I'm walking around talking, hey, DiBOSS this and DiBOSS that, almost as though it's living and breathing. And that really, warms my heart because that's why we created it.
So this is another question we ask all the people we speak to. Is there an IoT application, either conceptual or realized, that you think has the greatest potential to make a positive impact on the future?
Yeah, I think the machine learning algorithm of the Internet of Things is, to me, most important because it goes back to Eric Kandel. And he wrote a great book called The Age of Insight, which was an amazing book that goes back to Vienna in 1900. And he tells the story of a woman who held large cocktail parties, and she called them salons. And she brought together the greatest artists of the time, Klimt and Kokoschka, with Freud and with the head of the medical school of Vienna. And if you've seen Klimt's painting, Adele Bloch-Bauer, with the beautiful gold dress that she's wearing, if you look at that closely, each of the fractals of that dress are the nuclei of a cell. Because for the first time, right at that moment in 1900, the microscope was created. So here's this amazing artist, Klimt, looking through a microscope for the first time and seeing nuclei of a cell, and he put it into this painting that is, considered by many as one of the major masterpieces of that time. So it was what the book talks about is this collision of art and science coming together, and that ultimately what manifested itself out of that was just this huge eruption of culture and science and many of the things that we take for granted today. Ultimately, the seeds were born at that time. So I love the alchemy, the mixing of the sciences with culture and with people. We're so lucky that we get to work in we call it the built environment, and it sounds like something so clinical, but it's really about people. It's about when I walk into a space, how do I feel about that space? Do I feel welcome? Do I feel like I want to leave? Do I feel comfortable? Do I, you know, so it's less intellectual and more instinctual. Jack Rudin used to say that there were more nerve endings, and I've never ever found out whether it's true or not, but I love the concept. There's more nerve endings in your stomach than in your brain. So trust your gut, trust your instincts, listen to that voice, listen, you know, feel those feelings and allow those feelings to come forward if you think something is right. And you know, our instincts about DiBOSS have been right, and it really wasn't an intellectual exercise. It was really an instinctual, we want this, we need this, you know, this feels right, let's do it. We didn't set out to end up where we were. It wasn't some grand plan. It was one door closed and another one opened, and we just kept going. And we continue to keep going.
John, thank you so much for speaking with us today. And for all of our viewers, you can learn more about DiBOSS by checking out the resources we've posted online. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.